My name is Amara, and the moment I pushed open my parents' front door that Tuesday evening, something hit me before I even stepped inside. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind where someone is napping or the television is on low. This was the kind of silence that fills a room after something has already gone wrong. The kind that sits in the air like a held breath. I called out anyway. Mama? Daddy? Nothing. I stepped into the living room, and that is when my stomach dropped straight to the floor. The television was on. The evening news anchor was mid-sentence, talking about traffic delays on the highway, completely unbothered. The dining table had 2 plates, food still steaming, glasses still full. My father's reading glasses were folded neatly beside his plate like he had just set them down for a moment. And both of my parents were on the floor. My mother was near the couch. My father was halfway between the dining table and the hallway, like he had tried to reach something, or someone, and could not make it. I do not remember screaming. People tell me I screamed. I do not remember it. What I remember is dropping to my knees beside my mother, pressing my fingers to her neck the way they show you in those basic first aid videos, and feeling the most overwhelming relief of my life when I felt a pulse. Weak. But there. I called for help. I remember that part clearly, because my hands would not stop shaking and I kept misdialing, and I had to force myself to breathe and press each number like I was moving through water. The ambulance came in under 9 minutes. It felt like 9 years. Standing on that porch watching them load both of my parents onto stretchers, I kept telling myself the same thing over and over. It was something they ate. A gas leak. Some kind of freak medical coincidence. 2 people do not just collapse at the same time for no reason. But surely there was a logical explanation that had nothing to do with anything sinister. I believed that for exactly 6 days. On day 7, the truth broke me open. Let me take you back to before all of this, because none of what happened will make sense without understanding the world I was living in at the time. I grew up in a household where love was not just spoken, it was demonstrated in very specific, very particular ways. My mother, Lorraine, expressed affection through food, through showing up uninvited with containers of whatever she had cooked the night before, and through an almost supernatural ability to detect when something was wrong with you before you even opened your mouth. I used to joke that my mother's instincts worked like airport security. You could hide absolutely nothing from her. She would take one look at you, tilt her head slightly to the left, and say, "What happened?" And you would find yourself confessing things you had not even fully processed yet. My father, Roland, was quieter about it. He was the kind of man who showed love by fixing things, by showing up, by sitting beside you in silence when words were not enough. He had this habit of squeezing your shoulder once when he walked past you. Just once. Firm and steady. And somehow that single gesture communicated more than most people's entire speeches. They had been married for 31 years. They still held hands in the car. I am not exaggerating when I say they were the blueprint for how I understood love. I was their only child. I carried that weight the way only children do. With pride and with pressure, in equal measure. I was 32, working in corporate finance, living in my own apartment 20 minutes from their house, and visiting at least twice a week. I liked my life. I was good at my life. And then there was Devin. Devin Alcott came into my life at a work charity event 2 years before all of this. He was not the loudest person in the room, which was actually what drew me to him. He had this particular quality of stillness that read as confidence. He listened when you spoke. He remembered small details, the name of your college roommate, the restaurant you mentioned once in passing, the kind of tea you ordered on a cold afternoon. He was thoughtful in all the ways you are told to look for in a partner. My parents liked him. My mother, who could detect a lie from 3 zip codes away, liked him. She told me once, quietly, after a Sunday dinner where Devin had helped clear the table without being asked, "That one is a keeper, Amara." I held on to those words. I kept holding on to them even when, looking back, I should have let them go. The morning before I found my parents unconscious, I had spoken to my mother on the phone. It was a normal conversation. She was telling me about a neighbor's drama, something about a property fence, and I was half listening while sorting through emails. She mentioned that Devin had stopped by earlier that week to drop off a bottle of wine as a late anniversary gift. She seemed pleased about it. I remember smiling. "Tell him thank you again," she said. I will, I told her. That was the last normal conversation I ever had with my mother before everything changed. When I arrived at the hospital that night, the doctors used a phrase that lodged itself in my brain and refused to leave. They said, possible toxic ingestion. They were careful with their words. They said, possible, the way people say possible when they already suspect something more definitive, but do not yet want to commit to the accusation. They said they were running tests. They said both patients were stable but unconscious. They said we needed to wait. Waiting is a specific kind of torture, when the people you love most are lying in hospital beds and nobody will give you a straight answer. My Aunt Phyllis, my mother's older sister, came and sat with me. She brought her hands and her prayers and her presence, which was more than I could have asked for. We sat in those plastic waiting room chairs and said almost nothing to each other for hours. Devin arrived around 11 that night. He was distressed in all the right ways, holding my hand, getting me water, speaking to the nurses on my behalf. I leaned into him because that is what you do when the world is shaking beneath you. You reach for the thing that feels most solid. I did not know yet that I was holding onto the source of the earthquake. 2 days passed before my parents began to regain consciousness. The doctors confirmed what they had already suspected. Both Roland and Lorraine had ingested a toxic substance. The levels in their system were not accidental exposure levels. They were elevated. The kind of elevated that raised very specific, very serious questions about how it got there. The police were notified. An investigation began. And I started paying attention. The detective assigned to the case, a woman named Investigator Hargrove, was methodical and careful. She came to the house with her partner the following morning. They walked through every room. They checked the kitchen. They bagged items from the dining table, the glasses, the serving dishes, the open bottle of wine. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. The house was exactly as it should have been, except for the 2 people who had been on the floor. Investigator Hargrove asked me if my parents had any enemies. I almost laughed. Roland and Lorraine had lived in the same neighborhood for 22 years. They knew the name of every family on the block. My father refereed Little League on weekends. My mother volunteered at the church food pantry twice a month. Enemies. These were not people who made enemies. But then Hargrove asked something else. Did anyone visit the home in the days before this happened? I started listing names. Family. Their neighbor Clifton, who stopped by on Saturdays. My Aunt Phyllis. And then I paused. Devin came by, I said slowly. My fiancé. My mother mentioned it. Hargrove wrote that down without any change in her expression. That evening, I mentioned to Devin, casually, the way you mentioned something you are not yet suspicious about. That the detective had asked about recent visitors. I told them you had stopped by earlier that week, I said. With the wine. He nodded. Right, yeah. I just wanted to do something thoughtful. I know I missed their actual anniversary. Which day did you come by? I asked. He said Wednesday. My mother had mentioned it on Tuesday. It was a small thing. Probably nothing. A simple confusion about days. People mix up days all the time. I told myself that. I genuinely told myself that. But it stuck. Only the real ones make it this far. Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. I went back through the security camera footage from my parents' doorbell camera, something my father had installed 2 years ago that nobody in the family ever really thought about. I had to call the monitoring company to pull the archived footage, because my parents had never set up the cloud backup properly. Devin had come to the house on the Monday before my parents collapsed. Not Wednesday. Not Tuesday. Monday. He had been there for 41 minutes. And he had never once mentioned it to me. Not when I called him Monday evening. Not when I told him about my conversation with my mother on Tuesday. Not when I cried into his shirt in that hospital waiting room. Not once. I sat with that footage for a long time. I watched the timestamp. I watched him walk up to the door with a bottle of wine. I watched the door open. I watched him go inside. I watched something shift inside of me. The next time I saw him, I did not say anything about the footage. I smiled. I let him hold my hand. I told him I did not know what I would do without him through all of this. I was lying through every single tooth in my mouth. I want to be honest about what those next few days felt like internally. Because I think people sometimes imagine that when you suspect someone you love of something terrible, Clarity arrives like a lightning bolt. It does not. It arrives more like water filling a room, slowly, incrementally, and then all at once when the level finally reaches your chin. Part of me kept constructing alternative explanations. Maybe he had told me and I forgot. Maybe the camera timestamp was wrong. Maybe he had a reason for being there that he simply had not thought to mention because it seemed insignificant to him. I am a logical person. I work in finance. I am trained to examine data without letting emotion contaminate the conclusion. And I will tell you honestly, I had to fight myself every single day during that period. Because the emotional part of me loved Devon. The emotional part of me had imagined a future with this man. The emotional part of me did not want the evidence to mean what it was starting to mean. But I had not gotten to where I was in my career by letting what I wanted to be true override what the evidence was telling me. So I did what I do best. I became methodical. I started documenting everything. I wrote down every inconsistency, every date that did not match, every story that shifted slightly when retold, every moment where his account of things did not align with what I could verify. I kept a note on my phone, password protected, that I added to every single day. I also started listening differently. When Devon spoke, I was no longer just hearing the words, I was cataloging them. I noticed how he steered conversations away from certain topics. I noticed how, when I brought up my parents' progress with the doctors, he asked very specific questions. Not the questions of someone worried about recovery. The questions of someone monitoring a timeline. It was during one of those conversations that he said something that did not register immediately but burrowed into me and would not let go. These situations can go either way. He said, referring to my parents. You have to be prepared for every outcome, Amara. I nodded. I said, I know. I was thinking, why does he already sound prepared? 10 days after my parents were hospitalized, I asked if I could use Devon's laptop to print a document. My own printer was out of ink. He said yes, without hesitation, which told me he was not worried about what I might see, which told me he had been careful. He was careful, but not careful enough. Because in the deleted items of his browser history, which he had clearly tried to clear but had only partially succeeded, I found searches. Searches about certain compounds. About how much was needed to cause loss of consciousness in adults. About whether specific substances could be traced in wine. About inheritance law in our state. About how quickly assets transfer when both beneficiaries are incapacitated versus deceased. I closed the laptop. I went to the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub, and I breathed. In and out. For a long time. I did not cry. I wanted to. The tears were right there, pressing against the back of my eyes. But I made a decision in that bathroom that I was not going to spend my energy falling apart. I was going to spend it building something that could not be denied, argued away, or explained as coincidence. I called a lawyer the following morning. Not a family friend. A private attorney whose name I found independently. I told her what I suspected. I told her what I had. She told me what I needed. I went and got it. Over the next 5 days, I gathered financial records, transactions that showed Devon had recently consulted with an estate attorney of his own, something I had known nothing about. I found a series of wire transfers from an account I had not known existed to an account belonging to a man named Prescott, who was, and this is the part that knocked the breath out of me, my mother's nephew. A distant relative I had only met a handful of times at family gatherings. A man who, I now learned, had been quietly feeding Devon information about my parents' estate for months. About the assets. About the will. About the fact that my parents had recently updated that will in a way that excluded Devon entirely. That was what I had not known. That was the piece I had been missing. My parents had changed their will 8 weeks before they collapsed. They had removed Devon as a beneficiary on any joint assets that would have passed through me to him. They had done this quietly, without telling me, because they did not want to start a conflict before they had more certainty about their concerns. They had concerns. They had seen something. And they had been trying to protect me before he could act. He found out. And he acted first. When I tell you that I sat with this information for an entire evening without moving, I need you to understand what that means. I am not a person who sits still. I am a person who responds, who acts, who moves. Sitting still with that knowledge was one of the hardest things I have ever done in my life. But I sat still because I knew that what I did next had to be precise. Devin's birthday was in 2 weeks. His family had been planning a dinner, a sit-down gathering at his parents' home. Extended family included, the kind of event where everyone is relaxed and congratulatory, and no one is expecting anything to go wrong. I told him I wanted to make a toast. He loved that idea. I spent the days before that dinner making sure every piece of evidence I had was in order. Organized. Clear. Undeniable. I forwarded everything to Investigator Hargrove. I handed copies to my attorney. And I kept copies for myself, stored in 3 separate places, because I was not taking any chances. My parents were still recovering, but my mother had begun to sit up and hold short conversations. The day before the dinner, I went to visit her. I sat beside her bed and held her hand. She looked at me the way she always does when she knows something is wrong but is waiting for me to speak first. I know, I told her. That was all I said. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she squeezed my hand. Once. Firm and steady. Just like my father. The dinner was a warm, glowing affair. Long table. Good food. Laughter. Devin sat at the center of it all. Relaxed and smiling. Accepting birthday wishes with that particular ease of a man who believes he is in control of how the evening will unfold. His relative Prescott was also there. I had made sure of it. I had called Devin the week before and mentioned, casually, that I had run into Prescott and thought it would be nice to include him. Devin had agreed without a second thought. The thing about people who think they have one is that they stop watching for what they might have missed. When the plates were being cleared and the table was settling into that comfortable post-dinner warmth, I stood up. I wanted to say a few words, I said. Everyone smiled. Devin looked up at me with that expression. Affectionate, proprietary, the look of a man who thinks he knows exactly what you are about to say. I said, I have been doing a lot of thinking over the past few weeks. About trust. About what we owe the people we love. And about what we do when we discover that someone we trusted has been using that trust as a door through which to cause harm. The warmth in the room shifted slightly. Devin's expression flickered. I set my phone on the table and pressed play. The recording was from a phone call I had captured 11 days earlier, during one of those evenings when Devin had stepped out onto my balcony thinking I was asleep. It was Devin's voice and Prescott's voice, discussing the timeline, discussing the dosage. Discussing what would happen to the assets once my parents were gone and I, grieving and dependent, was properly managed. That was the word Prescott used. Managed. I watched the color leave Devin's face. In a way I will never forget. I watched Prescott's hands go still on the table. I watched the other people in that room cycle through confusion, then disbelief, then a cold and dawning horror. Devin stood up. He started to speak. Something about context, about misunderstanding, about how recordings can be manipulated. I slid printed documents across the table. The browser searches. The wire transfers. The estate attorney records. You thought you had mapped out every corner of this plan, I said. But you forgot to account for one thing. What? He said. And for the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely lost. You forgot that I was paying attention. The police had already been briefed. 2 officers were waiting outside. Investigator Hargrove had coordinated the timing. When Devin walked out of that house that evening, it was not to go home. Prescott did not even make it out the door. The days that followed were not clean or cinematic. Real justice never is. There were statements and interviews and attorneys and more waiting. There was the exhausting work of telling the story over and over to people who needed it in official language rather than the raw, unpolished version I was living. But my parents recovered. That is the sentence I keep returning to when everything else feels too heavy. They recovered. My mother came home on a Tuesday and my father 2 days after her, and the first evening we sat together in their living room. The same room where I had found them on the floor. My mother looked around like she was seeing it for the first time. You did good, Amara, she said. My father squeezed my shoulder once. Firm and steady, but I did not tell them everything that night. There would be time for all of it. That evening, I just sat between them on that couch, with the television on low and the smell of something warm coming from the kitchen, and I let myself feel the relief that I had been refusing to feel for weeks because I could not afford it. There is something I need to say before I close this out, and I want to say it carefully. I loved Devon. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I am not someone who mistakes infatuation for love, and what I felt for that man was real, and it was deep and losing it. Even under those circumstances, even knowing what I know, cost me something. Grief does not require the other person to have been good. You can grieve the version of someone you believed in, even after you discover that version was a construction. I grieved it. I am still grieving it, in the quiet moments when I am not expecting to. But I also know this. I am my mother's daughter. And my mother's instincts, passed down to me through years of watching her read people and rooms and situations with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. Those instincts saved my parents' lives. I found them unconscious on that floor, and I thought I was the one who needed to be strong enough to hold the world together while they healed. I did not know yet that I was also the only person standing between them and what was supposed to come next. When I look back at the moment I stood in that bathroom with the laptop closed on the edge of the sink, I think about all the directions that moment could have gone. I could have convinced myself it was nothing. I could have let love make me stupid. I could have chosen comfort over truth. Ich chose truth. And the truth, as brutal and as ugly and as world-rearranging as it was, gave me back the two people I love most in this world. That is what I hold on to. You thought I was the easiest part of your plan. You thought I was the one variable that would stay soft, stay distracted, stay too heartbroken to see clearly. But I was never just a variable. I was the whole equation. And I solved it.